Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. This is Darcy with Topaz, and I'll be subbing in for Nicole. We are excited to welcome back Joel Wolfson. Hi, Joel.
Hey Darcy, how's it going?
Good. Joel is here to present creative essentials for travel photography or imagery. Before I hand over the screen to him, let me tell you a little bit about Joel. Joel conducts photo workshops worldwide from his native Southwest to Italy, France, and other locations. He'll also be hosting a workshop in South Africa coming in 2016. His roster of notable clients include Newsweek, Elle, 17, Houghton Mifflin, and corporate clients such as Apple, AT&T, 3M, United Airlines, and Pillsbury. His technical articles on digital imaging have been translated for use in more than 30 countries. Yet, he is best known for his artistic images and unexpected views of everyday places around the globe. And so, with that, I will turn the screen over to Joel.
Well, welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us. It's great to be back doing another webinar for Topaz. Special thanks to those of you in locations far from our time zone that might be attending this very early or very late. So thanks for all that. And today, as Darcy mentioned, is about travel images. And she also mentioned I conduct workshops all over the place, and so a lot of my photography is done traveling. And for a lot of us, photography and travel go hand in hand, and sometimes travel is the only time that we shoot. And one of the major challenges with traveling and shooting is time constraint. We're only at a location for a short time, might be a few hours, might only be a day. We don't always have the luxury of going to the same place several times on different days at sunrise or sunset or checking the light on it and that sort of thing. And also we have things that we can't control like the weather. So I'm going to try to show some examples that I've shot under some challenging conditions from my travels and how I use some of the plugins to optimize those images. I've got a few bread and butter plugins from Topaz that I use quite often. Detail, clarity, black and white effects, and another one called ReMask. And I'm kind of stoked today because I'm going to show you the new version of ReMask, which Topaz just introduced. They went from version 3 to version 4. The version 4 has all of the great tools from 3, only it works a little faster and it's organized in a nicer interface. So we'll be looking at that today. As you can all see from my screen here, I use Lightroom. That's kind of my hub for my digital photo life. And so we'll be popping in and out of Lightroom. I'm not going to go much into Lightroom itself. I know a lot of you are probably using it already, but one nice thing is it has kind of a similar layout to the way a lot of the Topaz plugins are with presets over on the left, your image tools over on the right, and in the case of Lightroom it's contextual, so if you're in library or develop module you get those tools and whatnot that are pertinent to what module you're in. I'm just going to throw in a little side note here about travel stuff. Topaz published an article of mine on traveling for photography on their Pro Insights, which is on their blog. So check that out if you want. This article is sort of gear-oriented and gear lists how to get your gear there, how to get it back, especially overseas, which can be as challenging as getting great photos. And then I'm going to be following that up with some more articles on tips and techniques for travel photography. You can sign up for my email newsletter on my website. You can also keep an eye on Topaz's Pro Insights, where I hope to publish the next article as well. So hang with me till the end, and you'll have access to those great discount codes and the drawing for the full suite. So the first image I want to go to here is this one, and this is a big arch in one of these hillside towns in Tuscany, and my wife and I were scouting for a workshop there. We like to check out the locations again before people get there, and sometimes we find some new spots and just want to make sure everything's in place for a great experience when they get there. So this is not untypical. We had a rainy day, and not only rainy, you can see it's almost a whiteout out this window. So I might be able to make an argument for this shot for kind of a zen or a no-tan feel, but I think it needs a little more. Granted, I have that nice bright red striped umbrella. And by the way, here's another little travel tip. Travel with bright accessories. It wouldn't have looked quite as good with a black umbrella. I take a sort of a vivid blue raincoat with me. Barb takes a vivid red one. And so if you end up with people in your shot, sometimes it helps to have that little splash of color. So when you're bringing things like jackets and whatnot, just think about that. So that's just a little extra tip. But I still think this could use a little extra. Now, normally what you see out one of these arches is you're looking down onto this beautiful valley below. And on the way out of the town, we saw this. So this is the valley that's normally below the town. Pretty nice. And we got a little break in the clouds. It's still stormy, overcast, but we have that nice godlight, or as a friend of mine's daughter calls it, God's eyelashes. And so what I want to do is combine these two images together. And there's sort of some tricky masking involved. Most of it's straightforward, but there's a few things like hair and little plants and things like that you'll see as we go through this. And the nice thing about ReMask is it handles it so easily. Although it's complex underneath the hood, and you don't have to look at all that, but the interface and the way we use it is actually quite simple. So I've selected these two images. I'm going to go under Photo, go down to Edit In, and then I'm going to open these in Photoshop. So that's going to pop us into Photoshop here, and there's my image. So pay attention to the layers palette in the lower right here. Normally, when I'm going to use most Topaz plugins, I would make a duplicate of this image so that I'm not working on the original layer or the original image. It just so happens that because ReMask is a masking program, it has the option in the preferences to create another layer with the image and mask on the fly, and that's how I have it set. So in this case, I'm not going to make an extra layer because Topaz ReMask is going to do that for me. I go up to the filter menu up on the very top here, pull down, go down to Topaz Labs, there are all my filters, and I'm going to go to ReMask 4. So what's this going to do? Drop us into ReMask. And those of you that have seen ReMask before, that have been using version 3, you'll recognize all the tools. They're just arranged differently, and I think in a lot more logical and efficient fashion, and it's sort of contextual. So most of what we need is over on the left here. Up on the top is the navigator. These are navigation tools. The hand is just like in Photoshop to move the image around. The magnifier gives us an instant view into the 100%, or actually to the right of it there's a tab where you can set whatever percentage you want. And that's very useful because generally when I'm masking, I like to be working at 100% and then switch back to overall sometimes. So, and there's 3 different tabs here. The primary is what we're going to be working in for this image. And then there's also one called color range and another called transparency, and as you click on those tabs you get whatever tools you need. And you notice there's what they call fills down here, which is just like the bucket fill in Photoshop, and then our compute mask button. So you notice that these brushes have red, green, and blue, and this is what Topaz calls tri-map, and that's the technology they use for masking. And it's actually quite simple and straightforward. The green is what we're going to keep, and right now you see the whole image is green. That's our starting point. The red is what we're going to cut out. So, and then the blue is called the compute brush, and that delineates the border between what we keep and what we cut. And that's sort of the key to this program. So you delineate that border with the compute brush, and then it'll compute the mask for you. So what I'm going to do is zoom this up to 1:1, and I hold down the space bar as a shortcut to get the hand, just like in Photoshop, so I can move around while I'm in the 1:1 mode. And essentially what I want to do is start brushing across the image here. And in terms of brush size, which is the parameter up here, my rule of thumb is to keep the brush size as small as you can and still make sure that you're hitting both sides of your border. In other words, that it's wide enough to cover all this stuff that you want to cover. If you go really wide, like too wide, you'll still get a mask, but it might take a little more cleanup. And if you go too small and your hand is not super steady like mine, then you're going to be jumping around on the border, and it's not going to work quite as well. So I've switched to my tablet here, which I find easier for this stuff that's irregularly shaped, and I'm just tracing around what I want here. What I want to do is cut everything, mask out the window so that we can paste that other image into it, and then black everything out. So I stopped here because I just want to show you that I'm just going over the hair here. She's got wisps of hair standing out, and for a lot of masking programs, for any masking program, that's a difficult task. I think ReMask really does it the best. In fact, ReMask was my introduction to Topaz software originally, because I was so frustrated using things like Photoshop and trying other masking programs on the market that when I got ReMask, it was kind of like a breath of fresh air. And I don't normally do composites. I think it's appropriate for this image because I want to get a feel for what you might see out this window. And you'll see in my example later on that I use ReMask for selective adjustments too. So we'll see that used later on too. I stopped here at this straight line portion because I want to show you a little shortcut. If you have a long straight line portion like this, you can just move your brush to the next point, hold down the shift key, and click. Whoops, I started in the wrong place. So I want to create a dot down here where I'm starting, and then I'm going to hold down the shift key and make another dot where I want to end up. And there's a nice straight line portion without taking a lot of time to do it. I'm just going to go freehand around the rest of this arch here. And I'm kind of going backwards from right to left here around this arch, and you can see even though I'm not terribly adept at the stylus, as long as I have it on both sides of the border, I'm good to go. I'm using my little shortcut down here, and I'm not sure what this thing is. It almost looks like a Thunderbird symbol or something, but I doubt it is. And okay, so there's my outline. I'm going to go back and look at this thing overall view. So now I have a section cordoned off here essentially, and what I want to do is get rid of the outside, essentially mask that off. So in terms of a mask, whatever is black is hidden and whatever is white is revealed. So I want to reveal the white, which all I'm revealing is white because it was a whiteout, and then the brick and all this stuff I want to have be my cut essentially. So what I'm going to do is use the fill for this, and because I have a contiguous area, I went and got my red bucket here. All I do is click once, and there we are. It filled that whole outside part with red. So my next step is to go over to the left here where the Compute Mask button is, click on that, and this thing's pretty quick. There's our mask. And what I want to do is zoom in and show it to you, and we're going to examine it and see if it needs any cleanup. The first thing I'll notice is look at that hair. I mean, look what a great job it did on that. It's just, this thing is just amazing. And that was without doing anything special. And if you look along the edges here, I might need a little bit of cleanup, but not much. And there's some visual aids that they have built into this thing. In the upper right here, you can split the view and then define that view to kind of help you, give you some tools. So the options up here is you can do the try map, which is what we were looking before. I can look at my original image, the mask itself, of course, and then the keep and the cut. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to put it on keep. And this background color, by the way, you can change. So you hit the little three-wheel thing up here and say choose background color, and you can change the color if you want. I think the gold color works well here, so I'm just going to leave. Whoops, what did I do? I went and changed it. Okay, so let me go back to I'll pick my gold color here and say okay. And what this allows me to do is I can check the mask where I have a little bleed. And so I can take my mask out brush, which is the red here. Now I want to run back over to the left side here, and you see now that I have the mask, this thing appeared that says magic brush. This is the coolest. So I call it the shrink wrap brush, and you'll see why. But when all I have to do, I'm back over on the right side here with the red brush from my knockout here, and all I have to do is touch a little bit of that, and it just kind of shrink wraps right to the edge. So I don't have to sit there and try to paint it right to the very edge. All I do is just kind of sample it, and it just shrink wraps right to the edge of the mask, which is really cool. Now you notice on my keep here, I'm going to have to switch to the other brush. And by the way, when I'm switching from green to red here, where it seems like I'm doing it on the fly, I'm using keyboard shortcuts, which are built into this. So it's the Q, W, and E key for the normal brushes. And my mask is looking pretty darn clean there. Now check this out, like how it got every little leaf on this plant, and there's even like some strands of grass or something growing up here out of those rocks. So I've touched this up pretty well, just maybe a little bit more on the umbrella. I'm going to go through here because I can still see some stripes, and we don't want any bleed through. And because we got that little bit of overlap there, I can just go through. And all I'm doing is just touching that, and it just kind of shrink wraps to the edge of the mask. I think that's just such a great tool, and I don't know of any other software that has that. So I think that's pretty good. All we do now is say OK, and it pops us right back into Photoshop, and there's our layer right there. I'm going to rename that Arch. I'm a big fan of labeling all your layers, so if you ever have to go back to it, you know what you did. So now that that layer is selected, I'm going to go up under the Select menu, and in the Select menu in Photoshop, I'm going to go down to Load Selection, and there's my arch mask listed. If I had other masks in here, they would be listed in this drop-down, and I'm going to turn this into a selection. So there's the typical Photoshop marching ants, and I'm going to use that selection to paste my other image into. So what I'm going to do is go to my other image right here. I'm using the tabs at the top to go to my other image. I'm going to go into the Select menu for this one and say Select All. Now what I'm not going to use this whole image, and what I'm going to mention here is that this image in terms of resolution is bigger than the one I'm pasting it into, and I purposely left it larger because I want to be able to move it around and just use a portion of this image. So you want to think a little, when you're compositing, you want to think a little bit about proportion between the two images and how you're going to use them. Okay, so now that I have it selected, I want to go to Edit and say Copy. So I've just made a copy of the whole image. I'm going back to this one, and I have this outline made on that beautiful mask that I got from ReMask. I'm going to go, let's see, I believe it's under the Edit menu, and I go down to Paste Special, and there's a submenu here for Paste Into. And now it just pasted my image in. Now I'm going to go back up into the tools here in the upper left for the Select tool. And you notice now in the layers I have that image in there. And by using the Select tool here, I can move it around the way I want. And so what I'm going to do is position this so I can still see the hills out there. And I get some of these light rays, which is a nice compositional element coming down onto the umbrella. And now I have a view out of this window that makes sense with the scene. Now you can, use compositing for other purposes, special effects and fantasy sort of things, but I want something that is, in this case, a little more realistic, and the actual valley that's outside of this town and whatnot. So there's my image. I'm pretty much done. So I can just hit the Save in Photoshop, and it should save it back to. We'll go back into Lightroom, take a look. I have a big clipboard because I had copied that whole image. Let's get back into Lightroom here. Yeah, and there's my image, and there's my before and after. Took all of, 5 or 10 minutes, even including an explanation with ReMask. So just one plugin, and I've got a nice composite image. So let's go to the next image here. I think the next one I'm going to show you is this one. I'll try to get through this somewhat quickly so I can get to the next one, which really uses a lot of neat tools. So this is kind of the opposite. It's a nice sunny day, but it's middle of the day. It's kind of flat, boring light. And we encounter that a lot when we're traveling, even if it's a nice day. A lot of times we have to shoot in the middle of the day. We can't shoot during sweet light at sunrise or sunset, or pick our time of day or time of year. So this fountain is in Ortigia, which is in Sicily in Italy, and it's in the town square. And this is I think the Fountain of Diana. She's a a goddess of some sort, a nymph or something like that. And so she's sitting on top of this funky looking sea monster. And so what I did here, just to try, my lighting isn't that great, but just to try to add a little interest to it, I used an ultra wide lens, 14 millimeter, and composed it so I've got a interesting perspective with these, the water from the fountains creating some nice diagonals, and I have her framed against the sky, kind of reinforces that whole idea of the sea goddess or whatever. And what I really envisioned here, and this helps a lot sometimes when you're dealing with midday light and you have some blue sky, is this. And that's a black and white version. It's a lot more dramatic. We have a lot of depth to it, and it just, I think, gives a better feel to what, you know, what this fountain is about and the little story behind it. So here's what I'm going to do. Before I go into black and white effects, I'm going to go into clarity and try and add some depth to this. Now, one of the reasons this looks kind of flat, aside from the flat lighting that I shot it in, is it's from a raw image, and raw images tend to come out of the camera kind of flat. There's a lot of advantages to raw, so I always shoot in raw. There's a lot more information there, but it does require some processing to bring it back a little more to the way you saw it. And so that's kind of what I'm looking for here, is I want to add a little bit of depth and a little bit of that color saturation that was sort of in the original scene. And here we are. So the first thing I am going to do is go over to my layers palette in the lower right here. I'm creating a copy. I'm going to relabel that clarity so that I know what I did, and I'm going to go into my filter menu and go right into clarity here. All right, so here we are in clarity. The first thing I do with most of these plugins is I hit the reset. That's in the lower right of my screen here. And so now we're back to our original image. Now, kind of like Lightroom and many of the other Topaz plugins, the layout's pretty similar with these plugins, and we have collections on the left, and collections consist of numerous presets. So in this case, I have architecture selected. If I select a different one, landscape, you can see those presets change on the left. So you can use these as a starting point, or you can go through and adjust the controls on the right manually. So if I pick brick building, that's actually not a bad starting point. If I do a before and after here, that's my before, kind of that flat looking image. That's the after. It definitely has a lot more of a 3D look to it. So by using clarity, we can get a lot more depth. Now, this isn't a bad starting point, and I could use this as a starting point. You can see it changed all my controls over here. So I'm just going to explain quickly what these are. Clarity is all about adjusting contrast. So, you know, a lighter or darker value relative to a different value. So a light value relative to a dark value, etc. And it divides it into 4 different levels. Micro contrast, meaning there's very little difference in contrast between 2 areas, all the way up to high contrast, where there's a large difference between the lightest lights and the darkest darks. So it's just going to affect, high contrast is just going to affect that. Micro contrast is at the opposite end of the scale, and the low and medium are kind of in between. So in this particular case, I'm going to, let me just reset it so I can run through this to see how we arrived at that nice sort of 3D depth looking image. So I'm going to start with the micro contrast, and that's going to affect almost, it's going to affect quite a bit in the image because there's quite a few areas that don't have a lot of contrast. That's a little over the top, so let me magnify this so you can see this a little better. I'm going to, now you can go to 1:1, but I like 50% a lot when I'm using clarity, at least with an image of about this resolution, because it's big enough I can see the detail, but it's small enough that I'm getting a bit of an overall, and this is way over the top here, so I'm going to bring this down for the micro contrast, maybe somewhere in there. So there's my before, and it's pretty subtle. There's my after, but it's already adding some depth. Now we're going to go to the low contrast, and we'll add maybe a similar amount to that. And you notice as I'm doing this, or you may notice that because we're affecting contrast, the darks in the image are getting darker, and as we go to the more extreme contrast, the lighter lights are going to get, the lights are going to get lighter, and the darks are going to get darker. And so I'm liking what it's doing in around here. As far as the depth, there's my before, there's my after. But my darks are a little too darks, and you see this white building in the background is almost going a little bit too bright. Here, let me go back to the overall so we can see all the tones. So it may seem counterintuitive, but when I get to the high contrast, I almost always am going to the negative. And the reason I'm doing that is because that's taking the extremes, which now have gotten a little too extreme. So the darks have gotten a little too dark, and the brightest whites or brightest areas have gotten a little too light. And if you see it, just to show you, I'm going to go real extreme to one end, and you can see that the brights really start washing out, and the darks go almost black. So I like to go a little to the negative on this, and that kind of helps bring back a little bit of these dark areas that brought the building down to a more reasonable level. Now right below that is tone level, and this is just kind of allowing you to tweak those levels separately. In other words, you know, the high contrast brought down the light and the dark, or brought down the lights and brought up the darks together, but I might want to tweak those a little. So I might want to bring the lights up just a little more, which I think I do. Maybe somewhere in there. The mids are going to, in this case, there's a lot of midtones in the image. It's just going to sort of have an overall exposure adjustment, just lighten it. So I did that just a little. And the whites I might, you know, if that building I still feel is a little too bright in the background, I can bring those whites down a little bit. So I think that's pretty good. There's my before, there's my after. The only thing I really am not liking about this is I don't like that extra clarity, so to speak, that extra contrast and everything in the foreground. I don't think that really adds to it. In fact, it's kind of distracting. But I'm going to say okay anyway, because we can fix that in Photoshop just by brushing it out with a simple Photoshop mask. So what I'm going to do is, now this overall looks pretty good. I'm going to go down to the bottom here and click on that little symbol right down here where the hand is, and that creates a mask, which right now is all white. And remember, white reveals, so it hasn't really changed anything. But I'm going to go over here on the left, grab my brush tool. The shortcut for that is the letter B. I'm going to make sure that my foreground color is black because I want to mask out this. And I also want to make sure over in my layers that the mask is selected. Now here's a little trick in Photoshop. If you hold down the Control and Option key on a Mac, Control and Alt on a PC, click and hold your mouse. As you go to the left and right, you can make it bigger and smaller, and up and down to make it more feathered or less feathered. So I've got my brush, and all I'm going to do is just brush out that extra contrast that we got from clarity out of the water here. And now I like that a lot better. I'm not distracted by the water in the foreground, but I have that nice depth. So I'll unclick this mask. So there's my before. There's my after. Let me just make it the image a little bigger. Okay, so there's the before, there's the after. Now, those of you that have watched me do black and white conversions before, you know that I like to make the image a little more gaudy, so to speak. When it looks a little too gaudy, like a little too contrasty, a little too saturated, it usually makes for a nice black and white conversion. Because I kind of like the color version too, I'm going to save that off, and I'm going to go back into Lightroom, and there's my image. Now I want to make it a black and white. So before I do that, in the develop module here, I'm going to make it gaudy first. And the reason I could have done this in Clarity, the reason I'm doing it in Lightroom is because Lightroom keeps a permanent history, unlike Photoshop, and it's non-destructive, so I can go back to any point where I've done an adjustment in the image, and I can go back to any point in there and change it. So all I'm really going to do here is add a bunch of saturation. It's probably a little too much, so maybe somewhere in there. And I'm going to switch to my mouse here because I'm having a hard time with the stylus for some of these sliders. And I'm going to go down to my tone curve here and switch it from a straight line to medium contrast. Well, to me that's looking pretty gaudy, so this should make a nice black and white. I'm going to go to Edit, and by the way, instead of using the menus this time, I'm right-clicking, or you can Option-click if you have a single-button mouse, going over here back into Photoshop. So now I'm making another copy, and this is so I can do my black and white. So I'm going to make my background copy. So you know what I'm going to do? I want to show you something else. So I'm going to go right back. I'm going to go back in Lightroom because I know some of you just have Lightroom. And so what I want to show you is if you're just doing a single plugin and you don't really need the layers, you can go directly into that plugin from Lightroom. So instead of going into Photoshop, I'm going to go into Fusion Express, which you can get from Topaz for your plugins. And so instead of popping us into Lightroom, I'm going to go directly into the black and white effects here. And it's still creating a copy of the image on the fly. And black and white effects has the same layout as many of the other ones. We've got our presets on the left, we've got our tools on the right. Again, I'm going to go down to the bottom here and say reset to give myself a neutral starting point. The collection deal is the same. If you click on this grid, you get a sample of all the ones in that collection. I typically start with classic, the one in the upper left here, and you know what? That's almost where I want to be. So I'm just going to do a few minor changes here. Now if we go on the right here are all your tools, and the conversion is the main one here, and that has basic exposure and adaptive exposure. And adaptive exposure is very powerful. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but basically what it does, adaptive exposure will bring down highlights without blocking up shadows, and it'll bring up shadows without burning out highlights. It's sort of a magical, truly adaptive exposure. And then the regions just divides this into sort of like graph paper, and then it'll apply that adaptive exposure to each region and then put them all back together. So if you have a complex image like this one, where there's all kinds of different values in all different parts of the image, you might want to go off the default and increase the number of regions up a little bit. You may not see a real big difference, even if we go all the way to an extreme. That mostly you're just seeing it in the sky, so it's pretty subtle here. But the main thing I'm seeing is it's a little too contrasty. So this preset gave me some extra contrast. I'm going to back off on that. I'm going to take the whites down here and back off of that. This is very similar to the control and clarity, just because I'm feeling like that building in the background is too bright. And now I'm almost done. All I want to do is darken the sky. So if I go down here to color filter, those of you that have shot black and white film or still use filters on a camera, a yellow filter will darken the sky because it transmits yellow and absorbs blue, so it absorbs the opposite. So if I click on this, that's way overkill, but I've got my, you see my hue slider is on the yellow. It's roughly in this area, the 30 to 50 range there. I'm going to bring the strength all the way down, and now just bring it up just a hair to darken that sky. Okay, so now what I want to show you is there's my before, that's the neutral, there's my after with that more dramatic sky, which I like, and a little more contrast, so we really get a nice sense of this. And I think we're done with that. That's a really nice looking black and white. And this is, I'm going to give you a comparison here. So there's where we started with kind of a flat color image on the right here, and there's where we ended up with sort of a dramatic black and white. And in the process, I got a color image that I kind of like. So if I decide to use the color one, I've got a color one that still has a nice sense of depth. It's a little more documentary than the one on the left here, which has a little more drama and a little more emotion and feel to it. So now I'm going to, I want to do another image because this has, this one's pretty cool. And you saw this one in the slideshow. This is the Cyclops Coast off of Sicily. And again, it was a crappy day. It was overcast and kind of stormy and cloudy. And you know, patience, they say, is a virtue, and sometimes it doesn't take that long. I waited maybe 15 minutes or something like that for a little break in the clouds, and then you have the sun. It's diffuse light, but it's still kind of spotlighting this this rock here, which has all this moss on it. And then you have a bright cloud, these bright clouds in the background, which kind of adds a backdrop. And the sky was pretty dramatic. Now, you want to see where I started with this? Look at that. So those of you that think you need HDR to get a really wide brightness range, which is what we have here, we have dark rocks in the shadow and bright light behind it. So to get all the detail on the bright areas and those foreground areas that are more or less in shadow, most of us would think of shooting HDR. A little impractical in this situation because the clouds are moving rapidly, the water's moving, and right here is, let me go to 1:1, is this bird. So even though I was bracketing to get the right exposure, and what a lot of people don't realize is that modern DSLRs, especially the better ones, have a huge dynamic range, huge tonal range, and a lot of times you can get all the detail and the shadows and the highlights you need just with one exposure. So it's sort of single exposure HDR, if you will. And because I shot it with RAW, I'm retaining a lot of information. Now this exposure is a little darker than I'd like, but because of the position of the bird, I was not able to choose a bracket that had a slightly better exposure. But nonetheless, I can still pull my image out of this. So I'm going to move the exposure up just a little bit here. And this is kind of where the magic comes in with the raw image. I'm going to take the shadow slider in Lightroom here, and this is working on the raw data, and I can bring that up. Now it's still got that look of a flat raw image, but you can see that there is a lot of detail retained by the camera in the raw file on this. So now I'm going to, by the way, the reason I did this in Lightroom is so that I could do it with the raw file. If I converted it to TIFF or PSD, I might not get all of that information, and Lightroom just does really well in this particular case. That shadow slider is probably my favorite one in Lightroom to bring up some detail in there. So now I will go into Photoshop because we're going to use ReMask, and we're going to use the mask that we make several times actually. Let's see, I'll close out some of these other ones in Photoshop. Maybe that'll speed things up a little bit for us. All right, so here we are, and I'm going to make, I'm going to work on this in, so we go to Filters, Topaz Labs, into ReMask 4. And the reason I'm going to use a mask in here, I'm not compositing in this one, I'm just going to do selective adjustments. So I'm going to grab that, let me go to a higher magnification here. Actually, you know what? Just so this goes a little faster, I am going to shrink this image down a little bit. So we'll still have plenty of detail, but it'll just go a little faster. I'm going to go back into ReMask 4. I'm going to go up to the 1:1 magnification here, and then we'll just quickly, what I'm going to do is I want to separate the rocks from the water. So I'm just going to trace around here just like I did in the other one, only in this case, instead of compositing, we're just going to do selective adjustment. And this is one of the ways, this is the way I use ReMask the most actually. So it's images where I need to select an area of the image and work on that independently of the rest of the image. Because in this case, what we have is this huge discrepancy in tonal values between the water and rocks and then the sky, which is very bright, and the water and rocks, which are much lower values than the rest of it. So, and you notice as I'm going around here that I have all these little birds perched on the rock, and I don't want to lose those. So I'm going to go to my overall here, and I'm going to just do my outline. I'm going to the overall because I'm just using that little shortcut I showed you before for all these straight line portions. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to fill the sky, compute my mask just like we did before. And in this case, I'm going to, let me magnify so you can see this. Now I could go in and just notice I've got a little area I missed here. So in terms of refining the mask, I could go through with the magic brush, but the other thing I can do, because I have sort of a tapered edge on this whole thing, I can increase the mask strength, which increases the masking on the weaker details, which is sort of that gray area. And you can see as I move this over, it kind of does almost that shrink wrapping thing on the entire mask. Then if I want, I can go through and do my little magic brush thing on any areas that I see that still need it. And we can do that split view again too. Let me go to where the keep is. So you can see the rocks. I'll change the background color here and make it a little easier to see. I'll go to the red. And so anywhere there's some bleeding, like right here, you can see a little bit of the red bleeding through on the rock. I can just use that magic brush to get it. And really, it's pretty good. There isn't much here to speak of. So I'm going to go ahead and say OK. And we've got our instant mask here. Now, in this case, if you look down here, this is where the mask is. We have the rocks and the water are the keep, so to speak. That's white, so that's showing through. And there won't be in the clouds. But I want to adjust the clouds first, so we're going to use the opposite of that. And I'll show you how to do that. First, I'm going to make my copy because I'm going to be going into detail to do this. And so I'm going to call this sky. And in this case, I want to copy the mask. So the way you do that is the Option key on a Mac, Alt on a PC, and just copy it up there. Now our mask is the opposite of what we wanted, so I simply use Command-I or Control-I, and I instantly invert the mask. So I'm going to go back to selecting my image in this layer, go into the Filter menu, and we're going to go into Detail. Okay, so now we're in detail, and what I want to do, this is set up very similarly to clarity, and so instead of talking about differences in contrast with the small, medium, and large, it's just for detail. So the most minute differences in detail get accentuated with this one, medium, large, etc. So these clouds, the detail is pretty subtle, so we're going to be using the small and the medium the most. And I'll go to 1:1 so we can take a look at these clouds. Now, when I was there, the clouds were a lot more dramatic looking there because this is the raw file. The information's there, but we just need to bring it out. So what I'm going to do is bring this up. Already we're starting to get some more detail. And that's looking pretty good. We can add a little more with the small, but just now you notice the rocks and water look awful. We need to mentally ignore that because that's going to be masked out. It already is masked out in Photoshop. So that'll just go back to the way it was. There's my before on, just look at the clouds here and here and see how much detail we brought up just with the medium, with the small. And I'm going to add the medium to that too and add a little bit more in there. And that's looking pretty good. So there's our before, there's our after. I'm going to say, okay, I like the way the clouds look. And let me make that a little bigger so you can see it. Okay, so we have that in a new layer. Our sky's already done. If I click the eyeball and turn it off, you can see all it's changing is the clouds, and you can see they've gotten a lot more dramatic and more how I saw them. So now we need to work on the rocks and the water. And to do that, I want to combine these layers into a new one. So to do that, I hold down the Option key, Alt on a PC, go down to Layer, and say Merge Visible. Now, if I just did a Merge Visible without the Option key, it would just compress all those layers, and I want to keep those. So I created a new layer out of the other ones, and we're going to call this, we'll call this Rocks and Sea, okay? So now let's, with that layer selected, now we're going to go into Clarity. And I'm going to start with a reset. And let's make this a little bit bigger so we can get an idea what's happening. In fact, I'll start out at 1:1 here. Okay, now in this case, we want to look at the rocks and ignore the sky. So we've done the clarity thing before, so I'm just going to go through these. And in this case, we're probably going to be using mostly the micro and the low because we don't really need, it's just the rocks, which are, black and gray in terms of tonality, and so we probably aren't even going to use the mid on this. So I'm going to add a little more, and we'll go to the low contrast, Add a little bit more there. Okay, so there's my before, there's my after. And what I'm going here for here is a sense of depth, just like we did in the other one. The rocks in the water were looking a little flat. So there's my before, there's my after. You can see there's a little more of that sense of 3D. However, as we discovered in the other image, my darks have gone a little too dark. So I need to recover those, and I'm going to go to the negative with the high to bring some of that back. And that's maybe a little too much. That's pretty good there. So there's my before, there's my after. And again, I'm just looking at the rocks here. Now, the other thing I need to do is bring back the color. So I'm going to use hue or saturation again, like I did before. And I'm going to start with kind of an overall. And you know, that looks pretty good for the most part, except the water needs a little bit more. I think this rock is just perfect. That's how it looked with that vivid green with the light coming onto it. And I'm just going to adjust the aqua and the blue in the water separately. So if I go all the way to the right, you can see the aqua is a little over the top, but it is sort of blue-green water, and so I want that effect. I'm going to bump up the blue a little bit in here too. Now, again, ignore the sky. We're getting those blues and stuff in the sky, but that's masked out. So when I say OK, okay, so now we're going to take, we need to mask that out. So we're going to take our original mask, which is just the rocks, option, copy that, and there we are. So I'm going to save that, and that'll save this back into Lightroom, and there it is. So what I want to do is I'm going to go back to this in the history here. So that's our starting point. Check that out. So we went from what's on the left to what's on the right, and that's a single exposure, no HDR. And we're back to the way I saw it with that dramatic storm and those clouds and the little break in the sun there that I had for a few minutes. So I hope that gives you an idea of how to deal with some of the things we encounter when we're traveling.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for all the tips and tricks you shared with us today.
Well, you're welcome, and thanks for having me, and thank you all for coming.
Yes, thank you so much. And thanks to everyone that joined. We hope you can join us at the next webinar. And have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.